Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review on Unit 2, which is the causes of the American Revolution and the American Revolution, or War for Independence. Looking at the review sheet from top to bottom, the French and Indian War. This is from 1754 till 1763, and that's between the English and the English colonists as allies against the French colonists and their Indian allies, thus the French and Indian War. And it's over what would be the Midwest, what we'd call the Ohio River Valley, western Pennsylvania, the Ohio area along the Ohio River. And this war is won eventually by the English. And the Treaty of Paris, which ends the war in 1763, surrenders Canada to Great Britain, of course leaving behind a significant Quebecois population in Quebec. During the war, you have an interesting attempt at colonial union called the Albany Plan of Union, at least really it's Ben Franklin's idea, and the colonies fail to basically surrender their sovereignty to make a common war effort against the French, and this is often contrasted with a greater successful First and Second Continental Congress that are put together against the English before and during the War for Independence. The consequences of the French and Indian War are significant. This is a pivot point in American-British relations as England tried to pay their war debt by collecting taxes, ending the period of salutary neglect and interfering with long American traditions of no taxation without representation. And you see this in the 1765 Stamp Act, which follows the Sugar Act, and these are revenue taxes. They're not meant to be just part of way of financing an imperial overseas trade and regulation, but the Stamp Act was a way to pull money out of America to help pay for the war debt in Great Britain. It was a way of ignoring colonial assemblies. It was a way of paying for unwanted British soldiers in America. And as a direct tax, it wasn't hidden in indirect customs duties, but it was collected at the point of sale on financial transactions, things such as deeds and contracts and the sale of books and cards and notably newspapers, angering newspaper men. Republicanism is the belief in elected representatives, and ultimately it's government without a king, and as a feeling, as an attitude or a mood, it's anti-authoritarianism. It's the promotion of individualism against lawful authority. One more comment on the whole system of taxation. The Americans, when they say they want no taxation without representation, are told by the Brits that they have virtual representation. In Great Britain, very few people could vote there either, and the Brits argued that Parliament had the best interests of the common people at heart, and the Americans, as Englishmen, also were not being oppressed or not being taken advantage of, but this virtual representation, in a paternalistic way, had them at heart as well. And the Americans weren't buying it. They wanted actual representation. The Proclamation of 1763, which follows the end of the French and Indian War at 1763, saw the Indian Pontiac lead a uprising along the Appalachian frontier, killing hundreds and hundreds of colonists, and the British government in London came up with this idea of telling Americans simply not to move across the frontier. And this would sort of diffuse the tension with the Indians and might allow greater control of the Americans. The Americans didn't like this for a number of reasons. Those who were poor could not get deeds to land to make a new life for themselves on the other side of the Appalachians. Those who had lots of land speculators, could not sell it. And colonial legislatures couldn't collect money on the tax of sales of land, which they had in plenty. The Sugar Act, this is 1760, I believe it's 1764. This is that tax on the sugar and that famous triangle trade that the Americans are pulling molasses and sugar out of the Caribbean. And they lowered the tax, and the Americans didn't appreciate that because they weren't paying it in the first place. And they were dodging taxes by falsifying the manifest, what's in the ship hold, or by bribing customs officials. And what's going on is the British enforce this with what are called writs of assistance. These are general search warrants to search anywhere at any time for anything. And if you're caught, the inspectors would get a cut, so they had incentive to harass you. And if you were caught, you'd be tried in an admiralty court, no longer a jury of your peers that might look more favorably upon you. So this is interference with this de facto free trade. It's enforcing the navigation acts in this system of mercantilism, which had been ignored for well over 100 years, this system of what's called salutary neglect, where the Americans were ignoring the rules and doing quite well. The Stamp Act, a year later, 1765, the American reaction to this is boycotts. These committees of correspondence or colonial organizations to coordinate boycotting British goods. And a Stamp Act Congress, where 9 out of the 13 colonies meets, big contrast with the Albany Plan of Union during the French and Indian War, where the colonists don't get their collective act together. Stamp Act Congress begins to, again, help enforce a boycott, but to send representatives to London to protest, to petition, to be left alone, to be allowed to have self-taxation. The boycott is effective, not because of any agreement with American political beliefs, but because of financial hurt. And there is a repeal of the Stamp Act by the Parliament, but they passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, which does say that the Americans are subordinate and the British government is supreme. Patrick Henry is one of the more famous protesters. He gives that famous speech in the House of Burgesses, and what the famous line is, "Give me liberty or give me death." Boston Massacre, a couple years later, 1770. In Boston, you have about 4,000 British soldiers are sent to enforce compliance with British taxes. This is a town of only 15,000, 16,000 inhabitants, and they come at, a lot of things are happening simultaneously. They're coming to enforce compliance against a law which Americans think is unjust, against these taxes. They are a threat to self-government. They're a threat to the peace and order of these towns, which don't like these young men walking around with guns bullying them. And there is an economic downturn in 1770, and these young soldiers are competitors for scarce jobs. And some of these soldiers are being forced into private homes under what's called the Quartering Act. And this is going to lead to mob violence against some sentries, and a couple Americans will be killed and wounded. And Paul Revere does that famous etching turned into a print that circulates through the colonies, in which he's essentially showing the British soldiers are a firing squad, that they're coming as executioners. They're not protectors. They're not policemen. Keep in mind, the French have been defeated. The Indians are long far away at this point from coastal cities. So who are these? What are these soldiers doing here, and why are we paying them with our money through these taxes? Boston Tea Party, not to be confused with the Boston Massacre. This is 1775. This is a ways down the road from the 1770 Boston Massacre. The Boston Tea Party is this trashing of a British ship and throwing this tea into Boston Harbor. And the issue here is that the East India Company, a trading company with India, has gone bankrupt, and to bail it out, the British government is giving it a monopoly to sell tea in America. And the Americans are drinking lots of tea at this time. Keep in mind, right now, the Americans make up, if you take all the Englishmen in America and Great Britain, about a quarter of the Brits of English are English Americans, or under the British flag would be Brits that are living in America. So the Americans make up a good chunk of those who are consuming, those who are buying British exports, those who should be paying British taxes. And the reaction of the British to this attack on their ship and the destruction of their property is the Intolerable Acts. That's a term in the colonies, and the coercive acts are the British name for the Intolerable Acts. Shuts the Port of Boston down until there's restitution made, shuts down the colonial assemblies, shuts down the colonial courts in Massachusetts, and puts the Massachusetts under martial law. Talk about an infringement, a violation of self-government. Well, this is it. And you do have a First Continental Congress, which is organized in protest against this British oppression and injustice. part of the intolerable acts, sometimes it's sort of put aside as a separate act, the Quebec Act, is going to give control of the Ohio River Valley, which, remember, the British and the Americans fought the French for control of this area. This is now given to Quebec. In theory here, now this doesn't actually happen because war breaks out and Americans win the revolution, but this land, which the French were settling, now is essentially being given to Quebec. And on top of this, it's noted that the French Quebecois do not have elected self-government, and they also have the hated Catholic Church, which is seen as sort of a reflection of growing British oppression. Lexington and Concord take place in 1775. Keep in mind, this is all before the Declaration of Independence. This is where the Brits march from Boston looking for weapons and ammo in these interior towns, and fighting breaks out, and British soldiers will retreat back to Boston. Americans will be shooting at them from behind stone walls and trees, and something like 100 Brits are well, I'm not sure of the number. It's a large number, something like that, are killed and wounded. It's a sort of a guerrilla attack on the Brits. A lot of Americans die. This is blood has been spilled, and then later the Americans will follow the Brits back to Boston, and overlooking Boston, you've got these hills. One of them is Bunker's Hill, and you'll hear about really they're on Breed's Hill and whatever. The point here is that the Americans are encircling Boston with the Minutemen, this army of militiamen, and they've got guns and cannon, which they've taken from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. And they're threatening Boston. They're threatening the British Army, which will try to push them off the hill. The Brits will push them off the hill, but the British are going to be bloodied badly, and it's seen by the Americans really as a victory. They fought hard, and they've inflicted some pain, some blood on the Brits. And the Brits will pull out of Boston, and they're going to move farther down the coast, trying to split the colonies in half by controlling New York. The Prohibitory Act doesn't make a lot of history textbooks, really should. The Prohibitory Act is this is before the Declaration of Independence. The British government declares that American trade is no longer protected, that any ship can be seized, and they've basically cut off American trade with the world, according to the British Prohibitory Act. And American ships are up for grabs. They're being seized by the British government, and Americans are the Continental Congress will issue what's called letters of marque and reprisal. This is permission for private ships to attack British ships, and this will happen, and on top of continued smuggling, the British government is going to burn 2 American towns to the ground here. This is all before the Declaration of Independence, and it's mentioned in the Declaration as one of the grievances. And those towns are Falmouth, Massachusetts, which is currently Portland, Maine, and Norfolk, Virginia. So there's some nasty business going on here with Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, American ships being seized, Falmouth, and Norfolk being burned. Thomas Paine will write this document called Common Sense, saying it's just common sense. Americans should declare their independence. Gives a number of reasons why should half of Americans who aren't English anyhow put up with being ruled by an English king who's not really English, he's German. And why should an island govern a continent? He makes a lot of sort of self-evident observations and points, and this is so many people see this as a catalyst, sort of a tipping point, pushing the Second Continental Congress, which will organize after Lexington and Concord to push for independence. Now, that Second Continental Congress will issue 2 documents. One is a peace offer, that's the Olive Branch Petition. Please leave us alone, we only want peace. And then there's the Declaration of Causes and Necessities of Taking Up of Arms, which says, you send more soldiers and we'll kill them too. We're going to fight you. So eventually the Declaration of Independence is written and it's declared on July 4th. The main author here is Thomas Jefferson. And interestingly enough, especially for a slave owner, one of the accusations against England, if you read the Declaration, okay, it is about 3/4 a list of justification, of specific complaints why we are declaring independence. And those reasons include violation of no taxation without representation, shutting down our assembly, shutting down our courts, quartering soldiers in private homes, burning our cities, seizing our ships, sending over mercenaries such as the Hessians. And one of the interesting accusations is forcing slavery, the slave trade and slavery on America. Now, of course, before the Declaration of Independence is polished and presented, the Southern delegates to the Second Continental Congress omit this. It is removed, but it's in the original draft of the Declaration. Some principles of American self-government are no taxation without representation, that government is made by the people, such as in the House of Burgesses, such as in the town meetings, in the Massachusetts General Court, which is the name of their colonial assembly, and these John Lockean Enlightenment ideas that governments are made by the people and can be changed by the people. People can withhold their consent. The influence of the Great Awakening, I believe, is significant. The Great Awakening is a split in churches, in colonial churches, and pretty much most of the colonies, with the exception of Rhode Island, have state churches. These are churches that are funded by taxation. Now, in a place like Virginia, you can worship how you want, but your taxes go to pay for the Anglican Church, for example. And eventually in Massachusetts, eventually there will be freedom to worship how you want by the Revolutionary War, but you're still paying for the Congregationalist Church. So by splitting from, you have to follow the argument here, by your breakaway church, you're not just making a declaration of religious freedom, you're making a declaration of political freedom. That several decades before the Revolutionary War, the Great Awakening is practice rebellion. It's practice revolution. It's practice independence. And the Americans are being schooled from their pulpits, from their pastors, through the theological arguments. They're being schooled in the language of liberty and freedom and oppression and resistance to tyranny. And long before this, in church government, in the northern colonies in particular, Protestant churches are largely democratic in their what's called ecclesiology, in their self-government. You have congregationalism, where the congregations rule themselves. They pick their pastors, fire their pastors. You have Presbyterianism, which is a representative version of this, where you pick representatives that go to a small council called a presbytery, where if there's an argument between churches, you settle it democratically through these representatives to a presbytery. Two important battles. Every history book has got the Battle of Saratoga, and this is the battle that says, this is the most important one, because by beating General Johnny Burgoyne in northern upstate New York, the French see that we're a credible opponent to the British, and licking their wounds here after the French and Indian War. They're looking for revenge, and they join us. They are going to give us credit in Europe to buy weapons. They're going to give us money to pay our troops. They're going to give us soldiers. The army that defeats the British at Yorktown is about half American, about half French, and it's a French fleet that keeps the British from escaping. So the French are instrumental in this American victory. And the Battle of Trenton is going to be a battle, and Washington's lost, all his battles. He's got kicked out of New York, he's got kicked out of New Jersey, and he's hiding out in the winter in Pennsylvania. And he's going to cross the Delaware River into New Jersey, and he's going to defeat a Hessian army, about 800 soldiers or so, with very little casualties to himself. And he's doing this about 5 days at the end of the year before his soldiers' term of enlistment is up. And he offers a huge morale boost, a huge confidence builder. And his soldiers who haven't won any victories and are, sort of basically doing a winter camp out, trying to escape being chased by the British, who are bunkering down in the warmth of places like New York City. Now Washington's army re-enlists, and it has been argued that Trenton is really as important as Saratoga, because without an army, without a victory, without a Washington as a leader, there wouldn't have been any army for the French to aid. So Trenton it's one of those victories, keeps the army together. Adams' statement that the revolution was effected before the war commenced in the minds and hearts of the American people This is a common idea behind the revolution, that this is not a revolution like you see in France. Let's kill the king and get rid of the monarchy. This isn't a revolution like you see in Russia, where let's kill the czar and set up a whole different communist regime and end private ownership of property. But this is, in one sense, almost an anti-revolution. It's the British who are coming in and bossing us around and taxing us and changing everything. We want to go back to the way it was, the status quo. We don't want things to change. So Americans had and have religious freedom. We had political self-government and things like the House of Burgesses. We had economic free trade. We weren't supposed to. We're violating the Navigation Acts and the mercantilist system. But things like the triangular trade show that Americans are prospering and just being left alone. They're de facto, sort of in reality, free. And that's the idea of Washington's statement, that the Americans really, this freedom isn't something that's just we're picking it out of the air in 1776. During the Revolution, the Indians largely side with the English, who promised to treat them right and stop the American advance into the interior. And when the English leave, they just abandon any promises to include any provisions in the peace treaty that would help the Indians. The peace treaty that ends the revolution is the Treaty of Paris, 1783. You'll know the difference between that and the Treaty of Paris, 1763, that ends the French and Indian War by context. Women during the revolution are managing property as their men go off to war and fight, as their husbands go to the colonial legislature. They organize boycotts, they make homespun, they teach patriotism to their little children. And this is this idea of Republican motherhood, that women have a duty in the home to raise little patriots. African Americans during the Revolution, they're fighting on both sides. Washington's army, a lot of the colonies are providing black soldiers who are being given their freedom. There's not a lot of enthusiasm to join this army as the war grinds on, with increasing inflation, with very few victories, with the threat of the British. And Washington will have an army, it's a ragtag army. It's going to be a lot of immigrants, a lot of poor Americans, including former black slaves. Lord Dunmore in 1775 will offer freedom to any black slave who joins the British Army. And there's this famous Ethiopian regiment. It's not real big, but it basically represents this promise that the British here are the liberators. The British are the defenders of freedom, at least for those who are getting their freedom by joining the British. And those who join are going to be dropped off in Canada. Some of them are going to be dropped off in the Caribbean. Others will form that new country of Sierra Leone in sort of the hump there of Africa. And perhaps as significant, many runaways will not running away to join the army, but will run away to be sort of camp followers of the British, hoping that they'll get their freedom when the war is over. And many of them die of disease and hunger and exposure, and many of them are essentially end up back in slavery. The Loyalists, another name for the Loyalists are the Tories, and this is, you'll see the number as high as a third, probably maybe not that high, but the Loyalists are those who disagree. They disagree that the war is a just cause, and many of them will have their property taken. Many of them will, after the war, be discriminated against, lose their right to vote, be punished and ostracized. And many of the Loyalists take off. They move to Canada, they go back to Britain, they move to British islands in the Caribbean. The Treaty of Paris, it ends the war, acknowledges their independence, pulls the British Army out of America, gives us all the land to the Mississippi, a huge geographic boon here to the colonists. We get fishing rights off the coast of Canada, and the U.S. promises to make restitution, to press the states to make restitution to all those loyalists who lost their property. During the war, one way to fund it was, hey, these disloyal Americans, let's take their property and use that to help pay the militia, pay the soldiers, pay for colonial government, and so on. And that doesn't happen, and that leads partly to the sequel to the Revolution, the War of 1812, where the Brits have got some grievances against Americans' failure to live up to the promises of the Treaty of Paris. Of course, the Americans have some grievances too. The British don't leave their forts and are arming the Indians in the West, and there's going to be a new rebellion by Tecumseh against American colonists. So anyhow, here's your drive-by, your review. Study early, study smart, and good luck.